So here we're going to talk about neonatal mortality and birth weight as it specifically relates to that. The reason that we're interested in this is that lamb mortality is a pretty big issue, and reproductive performance in merino ewes is becoming increasingly important for merino enterprises. But we need better genetic information around reproduction and lamb survival. So this work that we did was focused on collection of birth records, particularly in the base ewes, so when they were giving birth to the 17 and 18 drop progeny. And the reason that we were so keen to collect birth records is that it enables us to separate some of the sources of mortality, so when they actually occur. We're also interested in the cause of death in these lambs. So as I said, this is specifically about the 17 and 18 drop lambs that were born. We collected birth records. That was done by twice daily lambing rounds. Collected a whole bunch of information that's listed there, but in this particular, at the moment, we're talking about mostly about birth weight in relation to that. So what we have here is a graph that shows you the birth weight in relation to lamb survival up to marking. And what you see there is that the vast majority of the lambs that survive are close to the average birth weight, and survival declines in both directions, so as they get lighter and as they get heavier as you move further away from the mean birth weight. And this is a pretty standard sort of curve. It's what you would commonly see in merino populations. If we add the effect of litter size into this, we see two slightly different curves. So this one here just shows you the lambs that were born as singles, and you can see that most of them are somewhere close to the mean birth weight. The birth weight of single-born lambs is heavier than the overall mean, but then survival starts to decline as they get much heavier than the average birth weight. If we then add in the twins to that, we see that there's a fair few that are around the average birth weight. The average birth weight of the twins is lighter than the lambs overall, and that survival tends to drop off fairly quickly once they move further and further away to the left of the mean birth weight. We've done this exercise for every individual sire that we've mated in the MLP flock at Armidale, and this here is just an example of 4 of them to show you the different sorts of patterns that you see for different sires. So what we've got here is sire number 1, the black dots. He's one that's pretty average, so mimics that earlier curve that I showed you that is similar to most merino populations. If you then look at the yellow dots, which is sire number 12, that's a sire that had progeny that were quite high in birth weight, and as a consequence, a lot of those lambs died from dystocia. If you then look at the pink dots, which is sire number 3, you can see that there's a linear relationship there, and that's a sire that had quite high overall survival rate. So he hardly lost any progeny at all, and birth weight had effectively no effect. And then if the last one is the blue dots, he also has a fairly linear sort of relationship, but this is a sire that had a lot of twins, and consequently a lot of the lambs were low birth weight, and so he had high mortality at that lower birth weight end. But high birth weight lambs were really not a problem for that sire. So that just gives you an indication of the sorts of variation that you see between sires. What I forgot to mention earlier on was that when we did the birth records on these lambs, I think I did say that there was no autopsy done on the dead lambs. We tried our best to estimate cause of death from educated field observation, if you like. And a lot of the people that do these lambing rounds have been doing it for quite a long time. This is what we come up with. We didn't try to separate the different sorts of dystocia, so we've put them all in together, and they accounted for more than 40% of all of the mortalities in those years. We also didn't try to separate starvation from exposure because externally they can be quite similar. And so we've lumped them in together, and they account for about another 40% of mortality. And the other things like primary predation and all of those other peripheral causes of death make up, only 10 to 15% of the total mortalities. If we then look at this in terms of numbers of dead lambs in a bit of a different way, what you see from this graph is that the lambs that died from dystocia had a higher birth weight, and the lambs that died from starvation and exposure had a lower average birth weight. So effectively, we've got a bimodal population there with different average birth weights depending on the cause of death. This figure here shows you the total neonatal mortality on the vertical axis, and along the bottom there's a bar for every one of the individual sires that were mated in the Armadale flock. And what you take from this is that there is quite a lot of variation between sires in neonatal mortality. So remembering these sheep have all been run the same, but we've got some sires that only had 6% mortality, and then we've got other sires that had more than 25%. So that's a 20% difference in lamb mortality. And in terms of the profitability of your enterprise, 20% lambs can make quite a big difference. So there is a lot of sire variation in lamb mortality. This is the same graph again, but what I've done here is separate it into effectively three main categories of mortality, which is dystocia, starvation, and I've put all the others in together. And what you see here is that not only is there variation between sires in the total mortality, but also the causes of those mortalities. So where the red arrows are there is just a couple of examples. So sire number 23, for example, had above average mortality, but the vast majority of them were due to starvation, as opposed to the other one with the red arrow, which is sire number 1. He also had above average mortality, but the majority of them were due to dystocia. So what that's telling us is not only is there difference between sires, but also the reason for those deaths. What we've got here is the within flock sire breeding values for weaner survival and birth weight. And that does show us that there is an unfavourable relationship between birth weight and survival, and certainly those sires that had the above average birth weights did end up with lower weaner survival. So just to wrap it up on this, I guess the take-home messages are that yes, lamb survival is associated with birth weight. I don't think anybody's probably particularly surprised about that. Dystocia and starvation are the main causes of those mortalities, and that's also pretty well accepted in industry. Maybe what's not so commonly known is that there is large sire variation in the amount of neonatal mortality, and not only that the predominant cause of those mortalities varies with sire. I would just like to acknowledge the people that have contributed to this, and this is largely the people that do the lambing rounds. It is a really big job to do birth records on this number of animals. It can be pretty full on at times, especially with these two lambings, which were AI, and there were a lot of lambs and a lot of twins born in a very short space of time. So I do thank the lambing teams that did that work.